I do also think being a founder is a bit of an illness, to be honest. I genuinely think 99.9% of people should not be a founder. They'd probably want to jump off a cliff, because you read the stories of people that sold their business for 50 million quid and think that's like the majority, when it's the vast minority.
Hi, I'm Lucy.
And I'm Yasmin.
And we started an online community called Ecomm Girls Club because we had no friends.
Well, no, we had friends, just not friends working in e-commerce, D2C marketing and brand building like us.
And now we do. Ecomm Girls Club is the first international community exclusively for girls in e-commerce, and we have a lot to say about it.
So we started a podcast. We'll be here each week to talk about the highs and lows of entrepreneurship, building online business and the problems we face in the e-com industry.
And we'll also be sharing the stories of the amazing women within our community who are all crushing it. So let's get into it. I mean, thank you for coming on to the podcast. It's kind of weird. I've been on your podcast before, but maybe like a year ago. But I've known Matt for literally a couple of years now, which is pretty scary. And we've worked together for that whole time. We met on Twitter, which is a wild story. Because initially I started helping out on Matt's podcast, Midnight Podcast, which you should check out. But Matt, I mean, you're like an ecom pro, so do you want to introduce yourself? You'll probably do a better job.
Yeah, I definitely don't think I'm an ecom pro. I suppose I have had the pod that I've kind of been really lazy with recently, which is a whole other issue. But yeah, I've been full-time in e-commerce my entire adult life, basically. So done a bunch of things. I think my problem in hindsight is I've never stuck with one thing for long enough to retire off it, but I'm working on that. People tell me I'm doing all right, but I often don't think I am. So I guess that's kind of the mindset of a founder, maybe. But yeah, I've been full-time in this space for like nearly 7 years now, which is crazy. It makes me feel very old and time is flying. But now I run a mushroom brand called Spacegoods, which is quite random because people will ask me, like, what do you do? And I say I run a pink mushroom brand. And it's quite funny how that has happened, because it was never the initial plan when I was like 18. So yeah, that's kind of, I guess, the alchemy of entrepreneurship. You just make shit and end up in a strange situation.
Yeah. And do you know what's really cool is I heard of Spacegoods like before I even knew Jim, before I knew you. And so you've been doing it now, for a couple of years, right?
Nearly 2 years, yes. We launched in April 22, which is flown by, to be fair.
Yeah. And before that, can you just give us like a top line overview of what you were doing before Spacegoods?
Yeah, so very quick whistle-stop tour. My first ever, I had a bit of a weird like entrance into founderism, I suppose. I used to draw logos, and then I had a clothing brand when I was like 18, which was absolutely terrible. Didn't know what I was doing. I was on Shopify in like 2014 at the time, which is quite early in hindsight. Didn't know ads, didn't know anything, had no money. I then went to uni, did a few different things, discovered drop shipping in uni when I was like 19, 20, started drop shipping jeans from China back when Geordie Shore was like popping off in 2015, 16. That was the first time I discovered paid ads and thought, wow, there's potential here. And the goal was just not have to get a job after uni or drop out of uni. And I did drop out of uni with that business. That then became, I guess, more of a proper brand in the sense that we designed our own products, held stock, etc. This is with Ollie from Soar, actually. That's how I met him originally. So it's a small world. That business then fell apart because we had a trademark issue and he wasn't really interested in working on it and he wanted to be at uni. I didn't. So I went traveling, went to Bali for the first time, launched a bunch of different drop shipping websites, just keen to make money any way I could. This was when Facebook ads were way less competitive and it was way easier, I think, to print money from drop shipping. But then I got kind of bored of that, did that for like 2 years, moved to London, launched a jewelry business called Midnight City, which was, I guess, a proper brand again in the sense that I designed all the products, wasn't drop shipping, etc. Grew that to about 3 million run rate, profitable. Was never really interested in jewelry. It was like a decent lifestyle business. Spent loads of money on stupid shit, traveled a lot, bought a nice car, all this. Moved in with Fred, who's the founder of Sanucci, who's when I met him originally back in 2019. So I ran that business in 2019. And then at the end of 2019, start of 2020, which in hindsight was the COVID boom, I launched a business called Neon Beach, which was very problematic. Basically, that was LED neon signs. Being very like me, I just if I see something, I'll just launch it within about a week. I don't really think about it much, which is probably a good thing and a bad thing in hindsight. Very good at 0 to 1, I think. Grew that business to about $1 million a month in about 4 months, which was the quickest I'd ever seen anything grow. It was branded drop shipping, I guess, but it was bespoke products. So it was impossible not to be drop shipped to some extent. Had a team of like 40 people in the Philippines, which at the time felt normal, but I guess looking back now, I was 24, doing like over $1 million a month in revenue across 2 businesses, owning the whole thing. It was quite unusual, very niche. So life was good. I was working a lot, but it was enjoyable. Very long story short, that business went very tits up very quickly. I moved my production from China to the UK, and this is a story I've told and paraphrased many times, but moved the production from China to the UK thinking that would be the next step in improving the supply chain. Actually, the irony was that broke the supply chain very much, and this factory that I paid loads of money up front couldn't fulfill anything and were having financial issues themselves, which I didn't know about because I didn't do enough due diligence and was very naive. So basically they couldn't fulfill like 3 million quid's worth of orders during Q4. And that business quickly went from having 7 figures in the bank to being insolvent in about 3 months, which sounds exaggerated, but it's quite literally not. I then had to put that business into a pre-pack administration, which I didn't know what that was 2 weeks before doing it. No investors, no one wise around me at the time. So yeah, that was very painful. That was in March 21, so 3 years ago now, which is crazy. I then worked with the guys that bought that business, which was actually a guy called Jack, who's the founder of Wayflyer, which are a big fintech. Well, they're a lender really, but they call themselves a fintech. I guess they are to some extent. I then worked with them for 6 months on a salary for the first time in my life, which was very painful emotionally. Broke up my ex-girlfriend, gained like 3 stone, the classic story. I then sold my shares in that for a bit of money in September 21 and thought, well, I'm obviously going to do my own thing again because I'd rather jump off a cliff than be an employee for any longer. And then around that time, I'd always been interested in nootropic supplements. I'd got myself into a bad place mentally and physically at the time. And then I went down this road of kind of reading about magic mushrooms and psilocybin. I'd been to Amsterdam a few times and thought, this is fun, but I didn't really know about kind of microdosing for mental health. And now there's been a lot of research over the past few years that, you know, basically cures depression to some extent, but it's controversial because it's still illegal. And I don't think that'll always be the case, but that was the first interest in mushrooms broadly, was actually magic mushrooms. I then thought, well, I can't sell a class A drug on the internet, not for very long, but I can build a product that the initial premise of Rainbow Dust was a legal alternative to a psychedelic microdose. It wasn't a mushroom coffee, although in reality, really it is kind of just a mushroom coffee. But that was why the brand is very pink and purple and called Rainbow Dust, as it was kind of a nod to psychedelics. And also alongside that, I just often see brands blow up in America and concepts blow up in America, then come over here a bit later. And that was the whole mushroom thing. I'd seen brands like Mudwater, Everyday Dose, Four Sigmatic, and thought there's no one really doing it in the UK. Dirty were probably the only brand in the UK at the time that even existed that I'd seen. So yeah, built conviction in the space and thought, well, fuck it, I'll do this next. The unit economics are nice. It's a subscription product, which I'd never done. So that's basically how I got into doing mushroom shit. And then I launched the brand at the end of April 22. I've been running it ever since. So yeah, that's the quick version of the story.
It's so interesting because like you've just explained the last 5 or 6 years in 6 minutes. And as we know, being on the back end in D2C and creating brands, there's so much that goes into it. So like my first question to you is, I watched one of your YouTube videos the other day and you were talking about how you actually started Spacegoods, right? No, they're good because they're only like 10 minutes long, like over the last couple of weeks. So you can like bosh through them and get loads of information. And you were like, I literally just started making it in my kitchen. Okay, so like these origin stories are really interesting, but like what I want to know is, how did you actually start this business? So what were those first few weeks in terms of like finding your supplier, like what's the ingredients that go into it, like the formulation? So for people listening, just a bit more detail I think is really important and useful on how did you actually start? Can you just give us a bit of context on that?
Yeah, well, I think the 0 to 1 is probably the hardest part for a lot of people. I've always found it to be the easiest part. I think the thing I've struggled with is going past a few million in revenue. I've done that 3 times, but I haven't gone to like 30 million in revenue yet, which I'm trying to do with this one. But so yeah, I suppose 0 to 1 always felt kind of easy to me because I've done it before. But practically, I mean, it starts with deciding what you're going to do. I decided I was going to create a mushroom all-in-one blend to rival the ones in America. It was going to be called Rainbow Dust. The brand was going to be called Spacegoods. And all brand names and everything, I think, sound ridiculous until they're famous anyway. So
I so agree.
Gymshark is a shit name, but it's a great name now because they've got 10 million followers. So I think people overthink what a brand is going to be called and stuff. I think just go with something that you can get the .com. That tends to help. So yeah, I decided what it was going to be. Then it's just a case of I'd never built a consumable product, never done supplements, probably very naive in many ways, but I decided I wanted to make it in the UK because it felt like a recipe for disaster, having had the previous issues with supply chain, to make it in like China, which would have been my initial first step. So yeah, it's just a case of literally Googling supplement manufacturer UK and emailing 50 of them, and then speaking to 5 of them, and then sampling with 3 of them, and then picking one of them. And then I guess the other thing, a lot of people will say, well, that's all easy, but how do you fund it? I mean, yeah, so I had personal money still, but I decided to raise from angels because A, I thought more money was probably smart, but B, it felt like a win-win to have people basically give me money for my business, but also, you know, if I can bring on angels that have done this before. For example, Jimmy was one of my angels. Alex Packham, who sold a business called Content Cow. Jack from Wayfly was my biggest and first angel. He put 100 grand in.
Nice.
People will say, oh, it's really hard to raise from angels. And yes, it is. I couldn't have raised from angels if I didn't have a track record of building 3 businesses to 7 figures previously. So it wasn't like I was some student, and I didn't raise from family and friends. Any of this don't come from that sort of background. So yeah, I raised a bit of money and then basically just bought stock. And I suppose it's the first time I'd committed time and decent amount of cash to something before having a proof of concept. But I was just so bullish on the area that I thought, fuck it, let's just do this. But I guess until you actually launch and start selling, there is a bit of the unknown. Like, what if you launch and the CAC just doesn't make sense, or people don't like the product?
And I guess
I suppose that was the first step.
Yeah, it's really interesting as well. I suppose it also comes down to what category selection. And that's why category selection is so important. So like you mentioned, you've launched a jewelry brand before. I've got a jewelry brand at the moment, but I was previously in beauty. The difference in terms of cost to get those 2 products or brands to market is astronomical. We could get a jewelry brand to market for 2 grand. To get a beauty brand to market with MOQs of 10,000 units, you're going to need a lot more capital. And so I think to those listening who are kind of thinking, right, how do I get into the space, or I'm in the space, how do I scale? Category selection is really important. And so I'm quite curious about nootropics and supplements. Are the MOQs high? Like, was your cost to market, I don't know, was it high? And is that why you needed the angels? Or did you kind of split that investment between stock and marketing, i.e. paid media?
Yeah, I actually think in hindsight, I raised way too much money off angels initially. I definitely didn't need it. And now 2 years on, I'm probably thinking, I could have held a bit more equity, blah, blah, blah,
really?
But coulda, woulda, shoulda. Yeah, my minimums really weren't that high. It was like 3,000 and my product cost was like £5. So I guess that's 15 grand in stock. You want a bit of money for marketing. I think you can launch a supplement business for like 20K probably, which is more than 2K obviously, but it's not crazy amounts. I think most people could pull that together if they really wanted to.
Yeah.
I suppose the main thing is making sure you can get a return on that early cash and actually start selling. Because like I said, if I launched the product and CAC was 300 quid, then it was going to be a non-starter. Luckily it wasn't. But I think that's because I knew what I was doing to some extent and built a decent brand from day one, good product, and timed it quite well because the mushroom space was kind of starting to boom a little bit in the UK. There wasn't that much competition. There's way more now. But yeah, honestly, I feel like I could launch a brand in 20 different categories. I think that's definitely my skill set. The problem is that the grass is always greener. Like even now, sometimes I find myself thinking, oh fuck, I should do something in hydration because that Humantra brand everyone's banging on about is shit and they're doing well. I could do that better. I think I could do a greens powder better. I often think I could do a beauty brand better than some brands because I just have ideas. But you do have to kind of pick your battles because you can't do everything at once. And on balance, I felt like mushrooms and this space was was a good blend of something that I'm personally interested in. I felt like the unit economics and the space made sense. And I felt like the timing was quite good. So I think people should try and find something at the intersection of those things. It's like Ikigai is like a Japanese concept. It's like the combination of something you're passionate about, something you can earn money from, and something that's good for the world. I think that's it. So I think if people are trying to find a niche or a space, they should try and use that framework. And there's a lot of things that fit that. And there's so many niches, I think, that you can get to millions in revenue in. So yeah, the market's so big. That's kind of that's my view.
I mean, to be fair, I do ask Matt a lot of questions on a daily basis when we're working together. But one thing that's quite interesting in your approach to Spacegoods is obviously you're building out what you've called like a proper team, whereas previously you've kind of run fully remote teams and used like resource in the Philippines and things like that. So I'm quite interested to kind of hear like how you've approached that. Obviously, I know some of it because I am part of your team. For those who are listening who don't know, I help run content at Spacegoods. But how has that been different for you? And are you finding it easy or hard, or like what's your approach been? Because I think it's a huge part of scaling a brand is having a team in-house in an office, which you've just acquired, if that's your route.
I still think it's the area that is the hardest and I'm naturally the least good at. Also because I think there's arguments to say you can build a big business fully remote with just freelancers, and there's many examples of that, but then other people will say the exact opposite and say, well, look at a business like Gymshark. They have a massive office and most of their team are in one place. And there's plenty of examples that are in between. I really do. I think it depends what type of business you're trying to build. Maybe we can come on to this later. I guess I've like raised venture capital now and so on. So I think part of it is because I guess like an efficient P&L and an acquirable business don't necessarily go hand in hand in every way. That might sound counterintuitive, but what I mean by that is if the business is going to be investable and or acquirable long term, then it needs to rely almost not at all on me. But if I want to keep my costs down, then I can do a lot of stuff myself still. So yeah, I suppose how I started was, it was just me doing everything. And then I hired a few people off Twitter basically. So Flo, who does operations, came to me from Twitter / the pod. Same with Lucy. Yeah, I think to start with, you just need a few generalists that can do general shit, which is why no one really had a job title. Like Brad did content, Flo did back-end stuff, Lucy did content and admin-y stuff. I suppose now and leaning on agencies. I think we still have way too many agencies in the business. We work with like 6 different agencies, but agencies, I think the best way to plug in a gap without the HR headache of having to hire someone, make sure they're good, deal with payroll, all this bullshit. I suppose this is a long version of, I don't really know what the exact answer is, but right now it's kind of a blend of freelance, PAY, employee and agency. And I'm trying to find the optimum balance going forward, because a bit of me thinks I should sack off all the agencies and get everyone in one place in an office, and that's the only way to be productive. But then next week I'll think, fuck that, I want to go and work from Bali for a month, and therefore I shouldn't force everyone to be in an office if I don't want to do it myself. So I suppose there's a lot of nuance to it, and I think you have to figure out what works for the business, but it also depends massively what the goal is for the business. If you're trying to build a lifestyle cash flow business, I do think that's a different thing to something which is VC backable, which I guess my business is now because it has done that. So I'm trying to figure that out. Sometimes I think it's pointless hiring really expensive employees when you can just get people overseas to do the same thing. But then I also think, well, long term, is that sustainable? What's more enjoyable? Do I want to be working from my kitchen for 10 years? Probably not. Yeah, I think it's very hard. That's the thing I probably struggle the most with, is like knowing, should I hire to grow, or am I delegating too much? Should I still be in the weeds, or do I need to remove myself more? No, we just hired a few new people, like a head of growth recently, and he would say this, and I said this to him, is that I'm struggling with micromanaging because I trying to get my head around the fact that he, well, is and should be better at the job than me. But I guess the thing I'm most struggling with is, does he care as much as me? Probably not, but he can probably care enough to do the job better than I can, because I'm doing a million things.
So what does that then free you up to do as the founder? So does that make sense? So if you're coming out of the weeds so much.
The irony with a startup brand, I think, is when you start, it's all about product and it's creative and it's fun. And like we did all these 80s movies and all this shit. And as it starts to scale, you do none of the fun stuff and all the bullshit, like looking at a P&L, looking at boring spreadsheets, checking your bank balance every day. But basically my job feels like I'm just an admin assistant to the business now to do a load of, I also don't know how I spend my time, which probably means I should assess what I'm doing a bit more and reply to less emails, because I definitely spend too long just staring at an inbox. But I suppose I would like to do more product and brand stuff, because that's what the business is. Like, there is no marketing without a good product. And I think there's way too much attention goes into Facebook ads, for example, on like Twitter and so on, and the whole D2C community, than the actual fucking product. No one really talks about products, it seems. It's almost like the elephant in the room, that no one can be bothered to actually make a decent product. So everyone just talks about how to hack Facebook ads, but you don't really have that without a good product. So I suppose I'd like to do more of that. And I suppose...
I mean, two things off the back of that is... Sorry, I was just going to say, one thing is, like, I think just broadly, regardless of what kind of business you run, one of the biggest misconceptions, if you're maybe like a first-time founder, is that when you run your own business, you get to do all the stuff you like. Because actually, most of the time, I think the first thing that you have to give away is often the stuff you like. And then the second thing I was going to ask is kind of on the paid media thing, kind of fitting back into what we were talking about, expanding a team. I mean, do you think it's possible to start a D2C brand in today's world without having someone in the founding team who really knows their shit about paid media, because I know you do for Spacegoods, but if they don't have that person, what would be kind of your advice? Because as much as you're saying, yeah, of course it's about the product, paid media is something that's just inevitably a part of it.
Yeah, I think you either need to know how to do it yourself or get an agency to do it, basically. I mean, yeah, I don't think you can grow a brand from zero without paid ads, unless you're a celebrity or an influencer with a massive committed following, or you crack like TikTok organic. But even then, I think that's very hit and miss and isn't sustainable. So I do think paid media is the foundation of growing an ecom brand, definitely. I'd done that myself for years previously, but I just felt like I wasn't up to speed with media buying. So haven't touched an ad account since like 2020 myself. Like 4 years
Really?
now.
Oh, that really surprised me, because I thought you did the ads yourself for Spacegoods and that's how you scaled it. Like when you were saying earlier, 1 to 10. I thought that was how you did it. So that's really interesting. So how did you do it then?
Use an agency.
Hired agency. Really?
Yeah.
And so just on that then, so did you use your own capital, your own money basically, to pay that agency, or was it all from angels? And that's why you were raising in the first instance?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the business started with a pot of money, which is partly my money plus angel money. So that was, I mean, it doesn't cost a lot to get an agency. You can get an agency for like $2,000 a month. I suppose if you got limited cash, that is quite a lot. But yeah, I mean, I also, the agency that ran the ads, actually not from day one to be fair, but the agency now, they angel invested in the brand and they're my mates. So I guess that helps. Just comes back to like having a good network and knowing people that are good at stuff, which definitely helps. But right at the start, I think you probably should do it yourself just to understand basic fundamentals of how to grow a brand. And I think if you don't, you'll probably struggle if you don't understand it, at least.
Lewis's question earlier about like, do you think it's important to have someone in the founding team when launching a D2C brand who does understand paid media? I think that's a really interesting question, because as I see it, paid media is like, out of the 2 distribution channels for D2C, it's one of the key ones. And then I think influencer being the second. And so, you know, we get asked a lot, like, how did you start, or who's in your team? And I've partnered with someone who really does know their shit in paid media, because I do think it's really important. And obviously you've got that background and understanding that. But then also having that agency approach, if funding allows is also really beneficial. So I'd say like, yeah, having someone in your team is option one. And if not, using an agency, because it is actually a lot more accessible than I think a lot of people think. I think people think agencies cost thousands and thousands a month, but actually network is very important here, obviously. But yeah, they are out there, and it's a good approach to take. I have a question, Matt, around the VC funding, and it's more of like a question on pressure and how that's affected you in terms of pressure, right? So there's pressure full stop. When you're a founder, there's self-inflicted pressure from day one. And I think that that's just something that's inherent. I think if you're an entrepreneur or founder, like that's just something that you have to live with. But does it go up a gear when you're moving from angel investment over to VC? What's that like, and how have you found that?
Yeah, well, I suppose I've done all three now. So as in bootstrapping, angels, and then VC. I think it's very different with angels because I knew all the angels. A lot of them were just my mates. So there's less pressure. I think in general with angels, it's way less formal anyway, because most people will just invest on like a safe note or something. You won't even convert until you close a funding round. They're not going to give you a founder's agreement with your shares vesting and all this shit. Very different with VC. And I knew nothing about VC like a year ago, so I learned very quickly by speaking to a lot of them. Yeah, some people think you should avoid VC in consumer. It's kind of a controversial topic, I feel like. I definitely think there's more pressure. But in some ways, it feels like there's less pressure because it's not just me now. So like they've got a vested interest in the brand. I've obviously got a lot more money to play with. So it feels like there's less short-term financial pressure. But at the same time, I also think I probably work better under pressure. Like I was quite conscious of the fact that in the past I'd done something for a year or two and then moved on to the next thing. I think taking external funding was a good force to keep me locked in on this, because that's the only way I'm going to get to where I want to go, is if I do something for 5-7 years, probably not 2 years. So yeah, I do feel more pressure in ways, but less in others. And I think you just have to understand the game you're getting into, because more money isn't necessarily good, but it can make sense for certain businesses in growing spaces and so on. I think there's pros and cons to raising money in general and not. And also the same with angels versus VCs. I think like angels, way less red tape, way less formal, way easier in many ways if you've got the network. I guess the downside of angels is it's a lot harder to raise millions of pounds from angels, because usually they'll put in like 10, 20, 50k ticket tops. You need a lot of angels to raise, say, £1 million, whereas a VC fund can do £1 million ticket easily and then probably put in more in a year's time if things are going well. So yeah, I mean, I've only been in the VC handcuffs, so to speak, for like 2.5 months now. But definitely learned a lot about it. Seems to be going smoothly so far, but that might change if we start not growing or something. So yeah, it's new to me.
And so like I'm assuming going into an office, is this something that you've wanted to do, or is this like one of the conditions of the contract? Is this like what the VCs are pushing for? Term sheet. That's it, Luz. Thanks. Yeah, where's that decision come from? Because that's going to be a big lifestyle shift as well for you, right?
Yeah, so we got an office like yesterday, literally moving in like today. Ironically, I've not had an office since I was 22. I used to have an office in Leeds with Adam Reed and another guy that's in the ecom space way ago when I was a much smaller business. I then didn't do that for like 6 years. I basically thought, I want to try having an office again. What's the worst that can happen? If I fucking hate it, then we can always move out. But I also do think, at least if I'm trying to build a much bigger, longer term business, it probably makes sense to have some sort of base. I mean, it's only small. It's not very expensive. It's cool, but it's small. It wasn't a requirement from the investors. No, I mean, they suggested that it might be a good idea. And they thought I should do it, but it's not a requirement. Yeah, I think it's going to be net positive overall. I think especially like new hires in London, I think a lot of them want to have access to an office, probably like on a hybrid, flexible setup. But I think being fully remote forever is probably quite challenging, although there are massive companies that do that, and there's also smaller ones that don't do that. So it really comes down to preference, I think. But I thought I'd try it because otherwise I'd never know.
One thing I was going to ask you, and I kind of know part of the answer to this story because I know you fairly well, but in terms of kind of like the pressure and dealing with it and being an entrepreneur, do you, in your opinion, do you think it's like something you're born with or something you can learn? Because obviously you've always chosen to go this route. And as you said, the thought of working for someone else gives you the ick. But do you think you were just born that way and built that way? Or is it, I don't know, something you think you can develop?
I genuinely lean towards, I think you're born with it. A good example is I have a twin brother who's the absolute opposite of an entrepreneur. We had the same upbringing, we had the same education, all this, and he has 3 degrees and a much more stable life than I do. There are examples of, people that work in big corporate businesses for 20 years and then go and start a business, but they probably still had some form of itch in them to scratch with entrepreneurship. I do also think being a founder is a bit of an illness, to be honest. I genuinely think 99.9% of people should not be a founder. They'd probably want to jump off a cliff. Because you read the stories of people that sold their business for 50 million quid and think that's like the majority when it's the vast minority. Which is either like a scary thought or just a nice dose of reality, depending on how you look at it. So yeah, I just think people that are really about it just want to make stuff and do their own thing. There's plenty of examples of people that talk about starting a business and do that for 10 years. I mean, I know lots of them, but they just clearly don't have it in them naturally, and that's fine. But yeah. I do think it's genetic to some extent.
I was going to say, I also think it's addictive. Like I definitely fall into the like former category if I had a corporate job, but I was always doing stuff on the side. But once you do it once, and Yasmin, I know you're the same from your background, like you can't help but keep wanting to build things. And it is like an illness because, I mean, we're very honest about the meltdowns that we have. But yeah, no, I would agree. But I think it's super interesting that you have a twin who's like the opposite. I think that's like probably the best example you could give of like nature versus nurture and which one it is.
Yeah, it's quite weird. But we are related. Non-identical twin, I'll clarify, but it'd be even weirder if he was an identical twin. But yeah, it is a strange example.
No, it's so interesting, Matt, your story. And like I know like it's been quite turbulent over the years and you've had loads of highs and loads of lows, and we're just talking, it does become a bit of a, like it plays you a little bit, and it is addictive just to want to keep going and going and going. Do you see Spacegoods as like, this is going to be it, this has to work kind of thing?
I definitely see it as this has to work. Yeah, I think I've put myself in a better position to give myself a higher chance of it working. And I suppose working to me is getting big enough that it's valuable enough that I can retire with it, I guess, eventually. Mm-hmm. But also, I do just want to build a bigger thing because I've done like kind of small bedroom brand a few times. Because I suppose like even if I was a billionaire, I'd probably still want to build a brand that was bigger than one I'd done before. So it's not just like money. It's also the challenge of building something that started as an idea. And I think it's pretty impressive that people can do that. And it's the culmination of just a lot of time and work and focus on one thing and dealing with all the ups and downs and so on. I think I probably tell myself that when I make 20 million quid, then I'll be happy. But I think the reality is I'd probably still want to, what would you do with your time? I often question myself, like, or my therapist who I've not been seeing recently, would say that, like, well, what would you then do on a Monday afternoon? Like, you still have to do something. And then it kind of comes back to, well, you're already doing what you would do if you had all the money in the world. So I mean, I still want to make 20 million quid, but the point stands that it's probably not the answer as much as I convince myself it is. And I think that comes from social media and so on. It makes you believe that everyone's 25 and has 25 million quid, when it's just categorically not the case. We just live in this epidemic of flexing and absolute bollocks online, basically. Yeah, that's kind of my view. And also, I think I've been a bit skewed by, I made some money in my early 20s and then lived kind of the fancy lifestyle, and I sort of set the bar quite high in terms of have had nice cars, I've traveled everywhere I wanted to travel. But then that kind of gets a bit boring as well. I mean, there's still plenty of levels to climb in that respect.
Yeah.
But yeah, I suppose, like, how do you want to spend your time the next 10 years? You probably have to work on something. So
I completely agree. And actually, I have this conversation a lot. And it's like, I think the question is it about, we'd all love 20 million quid, right? We'd all love to make, I think that's like that self-validation piece, like checking that massive box that you've been kind of like running towards for your whole career. But actually, I think the fulfillment and the happiness piece actually comes from the chase and playing the game. Because the reality is, as soon as you get there, all that you do is you want to play the game again, but in the next league. So that day to day just becomes the same, because that's what you love and that's what you enjoy, and always kind of having something to shoot for. I think that's the motivation. That's where the fire comes from. The money is obviously like a great benefit, but I don't believe it brings true happiness. So yeah, I just think it's a really interesting point, but one that, yeah, you're fully aware of. And then also just something I want to say that's really interesting is like learning how to fail and then go again is really important, because a lot of the time, as I've learned, angel investors and VCs, they actually look for second-time founders because you've gone through it once. So you've learned from the mistakes and you've plugged those knowledge gaps so that when you're given the opportunity to go again, you know how to.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think there's something so valuable in knowing that.
I definitely feel a lot wiser and less naive than I was sort of 4 years ago. Yeah, although I still wish I hadn't failed that dramatically, but I guess there are definitely positives in terms of being more backable, being more experienced, just generally having a better understanding of kind of the risks of growing too quick as well. I feel like a more mature founder, I suppose, which I probably never thought I'd say, but yeah, there's definitely benefits to going through shit. I think a lot of people are very naive when they first start something. So,
one thing I was gonna ask, kind of on the kind of piece about like, you know, how you see people doing like so amazingly, and it's hard to not compare yourself. You're, I would say, quite well known for kind of being transparent and building in public. And you share pretty much everything on your podcast, like the good, the bad, the ugly. What have you kind of seen as the benefits of this? And do you think it's been net positive? And also, like, has kind of having VCs involved changed your opinion on it? Like, do you feel more kind of aware, I guess, of what you're saying?
Yeah, I think I've accidentally just put everything on the internet now through the pod, and then like my series in process of building this brand. I mean, I initially did it because it was fun, and then I thought it'd be good to look back on. And then I thought there was no point doing it if I wasn't being honest. Although surprisingly to me, I don't think that's the angle 99% of content creators come at things from. I think most people come at content from, how can I portray myself a certain way to sell a certain product? And maybe I'd be much more successful if that's what I did and I link people to my course and so on. I just haven't done that. There's probably no going back at this point. I should probably like start a new series tomorrow where everything is perfect. But I think people would know it's bullshit. I think so far it's been net positive. I mean, I met some investors through the pod. Alex and Jimmy, for example, came on the pod. That's how I first met them. And then even like my investors now, I mean, I think they've probably had mixed opinions on the pod. I mean, I know they do, but some of them liked it. And I think that helped in the process of when I was going through raising money. They could kind of see who I was. I also think I've met people through like events I've done. I probably should use that way more. But it's a great networking tool. I think having some sort of personal brand, and I hate that term, but just being visible to other people in the space is probably net positive on balance if you're going to be yourself. Because I mean, if I wasn't doing Spacegoods, I'm sure there's an opportunity I could do the next thing tomorrow, because even just off the back of my pod, I could, I don't know, pull together the right people and the right contacts to do the next thing, whatever that was. I am sometimes conflicted with it though, because I think, to answer your second point, now there's more money from investors and stuff. I do feel like, where's the line in terms of being authentic, but also just oversharing, which becomes like a risk to the business. For example, I would never put like my P&L on the YouTube, because I feel like that's not net beneficial. It'd be like net negative. Because I don't know, competition could see it. Investors might get the wrong idea, all this sort of stuff. So it does feel a bit of a fine line. And yeah, going forward, sometimes I think I should do way more of it and go like full Diary of a CEO, behind the scenes vibes, and just like vlog. But then sometimes I think, fuck this, go like ghost mode, don't tweet ever again. I definitely haven't figured that out, because I tend to think like, in 10 years time, will I prefer that I filmed a lot of stuff, or will I wish I hadn't? And I lean towards I will wish I'd filmed more, because I've got an old YouTube channel which documented like my travels between like 2016 and 2020. That channel's disappeared off YouTube right now. I don't know what's going on. I think
Matt, is one of the episodes when you and Fred go to Hong Kong?
Yeah.
I think we were watching it the other day. Well, Fred put it on just randomly.
Yeah.
Oh, geez.
So I'm glad that I filmed Chicks. It's just good to look back at. And I often wish I'd filmed more. But yeah, I do think once you're online, you kind of commit to it. Like even just with one video, like it's in the internet forever. So, I mean, there's certain things I would never put on the internet. I think I've got the line probably just right. Sometimes I do think I paint a certain picture of myself on YouTube, which is probably like puts me in a more negative light. So I feel like the content I put out, I tend to only film if I'm feeling like reflective and or like confused about life. If I'm having a good day, I don't film a YouTube video. That tends to have been like the narrative my channel has gone down, which sometimes I think, fuck, am I just coming across like some burnt out, boring, depressed founder, which I definitely am not all the time, and don't want that to be my entire personal brand. But yeah, I think it's a hard balance for like any content creator. I still don't consider myself like a YouTuber at all, but I guess to some extent I am.
This has been a really like amazing hour of just, I had so many questions, and I'm asking you these questions, kind of thinking about the community and the girls and guys who are going to be listening. So I think like we could go on and on and on, but I just have kind of one last question, which is, if you were to give some advice on like top tips, 1 top tip, 2 top tips, 3 top tips to anyone wanting to start a D2C brand today, what would you tell them? And it can be anything from product. I loved your comment earlier about product and the importance of getting that right. I think people overlook that all the time just to get something to market. It could be team, it could be finance. What would you say are the main things to make sure you've got in place from day one?
I do think, I'd probably say one of the big things for me at least is just do something that you're genuinely interested in yourself. I mean, there are exceptions to it, but I just think it's so hard that if you don't really give a fuck about what you're selling, then you're probably just going to give up. So I think that's maybe somewhere to start. I think the next thing is just understanding the basic unit economics of what you're doing. Like, it's not going to work if you have a £5 product and you're trying to scale on Facebook ads. It will be physically impossible to make that work without burning a shitload of money. So I think just understanding unit economics, which probably a lot of people don't, like where does your CAC need to be? Is that realistic? What are your margins? Because they're always less than you think at scale, especially. So yeah, I think really ecom is kind of just a data game, maybe sadly in some ways, because a lot of people are like creatives that come at it, but you need to be a creative and a business commercially savvy person as well, I think. So marrying the two, I think, is very important. I also think another thing, and my flatmate who's probably listening to this in the next room is very guilty of this. And if he watches, I'm sorry, but it's true. Like, there's no point planning the idea and the product for months and months and months and months if you haven't worked out who's going to make it, how you're going to fund it, like how it's going to happen, because everyone has an idea for a brand, but very few people actually get it off the ground. So I think having some just practical, basic understanding of what it's actually going to take to make whatever you want to do real. I think way too many people spend months perfecting the fucking like mood board on Instagram, but they haven't even got a supplier yet. It's like, well, it doesn't matter because you're not going to be able to sell anything. And I've seen that before. So yeah, there are a few general things. And then I think just realizing that it's going to be more expensive, harder, and take longer than you thought in basically every sense. I think that's just maybe just a rule for general entrepreneurship, but also for D2C.
That was such a great answer. Thank you.
So one thing we're asking all our guests that come on Ecomm Girls Club podcast is, and you can't pick your own brand here, just to name a D2C brand that you think is killing it at the moment and is one to watch that isn't your own.
Surreal are quite cool, the cereal brand. I mean, I think they particularly nailed the kind of organic, virally brand side of stuff, which we very much haven't. So I'll pick them as an example.
I feel like that's a really nice place to tie off. So Matt, thanks so much for coming on. It's been really, really interesting. You were our first guest, so hopefully that wasn't too...
Oh shit, I didn't actually know that. Yeah.
Yeah, there's many. Yeah.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And to get involved with Ecomm Girls Club, search for @Ecomm Girls Club on Instagram.
And if you feel like taking your Instagram stalking one step further, we are both also on Instagram @Yasmin Sheik and @LucyCG.